similarity first. This is both constant in CVX and DSC. There is a lot more focus placed on the Claire-Steve dynamic than Claire and Chris reuniting. In both versions, Steve and Claire start getting closer to each other. In both versions, Steve stops being a nuisance to Claire after his dad dies. This is down to Steve even focusing on himself most of the time. Notice in CVX when Steve says,
"Hey, I heard there's an airport around here. Once I find it, I can finally escape from this crazy island."
"Once I find it, I will be able to escape from this crazy island."
I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here.
A similar thing was there in Darkside Chronicles at the beginning, but this definitely shows you that in CVX, at least on Rockford Island, Steve was definitely not flirting with Claire or coming on to Claire. Or else he wouldn't insinuate escaping on his own and leaving Claire alone in that zombie-infested island. In both versions, when Claire reunites with Chris, she mentions Steve.
Not yet. We have to find Steve.
Who's Steve?
He's a boy who escaped from that island with me. But then a monster attacked us and we got separated.
So that means Steve is still somewhere in this base?
I'm sure of it. Wait! Steve! He's here somewhere! We can't leave without him!
To add to this, the Wesker part is pretty much removed from Darkside Chronicles. This is Capcom themselves telling you to focus on the Claire-Steve dynamic. Also in CVX, in every cutscene where Claire and Chris are together on screen, there is either a verbal or a body language reference to Steve. Once again, this is more proof that the main purpose of Code Veronica was the Claire-Steve dynamic and the tragedy that follows. You know what? Just to drive this point further home, count the number of cutscenes where Chris is mentioned in Steve's presence and the number of cutscenes where Steve is mentioned or referred to in Chris's presence.
Chris Redfield. Is he a relative of yours or something? Well, I really hope you find your brother. I know what it's like to be alone.
We have to find Steve.
Who's Steve?
He's a boy who escaped from that island with me.
After her! She might know where Steve is.
Let's go. But Chris!
You've got to save Steve. Go!
My brother's come to save us. We're getting out of here.
Hey, is Steve with you? Just go for the emergency elevator!
Chris, but...
I can take care of this! Just go!
You have to make it. Don't die on me.
That's no longer a concern to me. I have Steve to work with.
What?
Steve.
Chris, promise me. Please promise that you won't leave me alone again.
Steve got more attention even when Chris reunited with Claire. This is Capcom screaming in your face that the primary purpose involves the Claire-Steve dynamic in Code Veronica, not the sibling dynamic dichotomy between the Redfields and the Ashfords. The primary focus is the Claire-Steve dynamic, and the story is that Claire and Steve are two teenagers who fall in love as a result of the bonding over family-related loneliness, which is one of the oldest love story tricks in the book. It's so old that it was mostly retired from Bollywood movies that centers a lot around love stories. It was retired from Bollywood movies in the 80s, before I was even born. Even their special items are family-related objects, making it even more obvious what CVX was trying to do and what plot device they were using to make Steve and Claire fall in love with each other. Now for the differences. Let's start at the very beginning interaction. In Code Veronica, Claire holds the gun to Steve's face and is super serious. Notice that she retracts the gun only after she hears that Steve was also a prisoner on that island.
I was a prisoner on this island.
as Claire ascertained that Steve was not a threat. In DSC, Claire is being playful with him. She holds him up playfully even after ascertaining that he is not with Umbrella.
Guess you're not with Umbrella then, are you? I'm Claire Redfield.
Damn, girl. You scared me.
Eyes forward.
Given the fact that she was 19 years old in both versions, the CVX version clearly makes her look more badass, as I have shown previously. Next point. In CVX, Claire treats Steve like her equal, especially after learning that Steve has some severe family-related issues. In DSC, Claire is a bit more mentor type with Steve, constantly reminding him to stay focused and not get too hyper. Claire does no such thing in CVX. In Code Veronica, Claire and Steve work together. In DSC, Claire constantly tries to guide and mentor Steve, to the point that Steve even expresses frustration right after the second sniper battle with Alfred.
I got it! You don't have to tell me.
In both games, Claire gets increasingly closer to Steve. But in CVX, Claire still retains her distinct characteristic features. Tough but kind-hearted good girl. In Darkside Chronicles, Claire slowly starts to devolve and starts cracking corny jokes just like Steve. This was my reaction when I revisited Darkside Chronicles and I heard Claire say this line.
Got now a long time. Try.
Maybe he likes being tied up.
Not that, please. No.
In DSC, Claire was turning into Steve. Imagine in the original Resident Evil 3, if Jill turned into Carlos and said that he wanted to ask her out because of her Caucasian accent. Or in the movie National Security, if Martin Lawrence turned into Steve Zahn. Next point. In both versions, Claire figures out that something happened to Steve that brought him to that island. However, in Code Veronica, it was more aligned with the narrative of CVX. In DSC, it's pretty much that one line where Steve says he can't forgive what happened. Steve, however, sells the severity of his family trauma much more in Code Veronica compared to Darkside Chronicles. In CVX, Claire sells the death of Steve's father worse than Darkside Chronicles.
Oh, Steve.
He was my father.
What?
He worked for Umbrella. Nobody, just another face in the crowd.
But in Code Veronica, Claire's body language to sell this information is actually better than it is in Darkside Chronicles.
He tried to leak some data, make some quick cash, but they caught him. And they killed my mother. And then they took me.
Steve.
It was his fault. He was stupid.
He was a fool to do something so reckless. So stupid.
It's okay now. Just rest.
Now do you see why the lacrimal theme was modified to the I love you theme in Code Veronica? More on that in the next section. In the Antarctica chapter, in both versions, both Steve and Claire try to escape using the snowmobile. But in Code Veronica, Steve actually finds a destination to where they can take the snowmobile.
Claire, it looks like there's an Australian observation base about 7 miles away from here. That should be our target. Look, there's a snowmobile over there.
Perfect! We'll be able to ride right over to the Australian base with this.
In Darkside Chronicles, this information is missing. So, in Code Veronica, Steve once again aids in both of their rescue, as he told Claire of the Australian research base. Without that information, Claire and Steve would be aimlessly wandering in the snow wilderness of Antarctica, which is pretty much a death sentence. And let me close this section out by this clarification. I came across this notion that some may argue that the game is telling you that Steve is incompetent. Nothing can be further from the truth. Steve explicitly saves Claire's life more times than Claire explicitly saves Steve's life. That's like saying in Resident Evil 3, Carlos was incompetent because Carlos was annoying. The game is telling you that Steve is not only competent, but he is actually important in Claire's protection. And there is this dumb notion that Claire solving puzzles is adding towards saving Steve's life. That's like saying Jill twisting a crank to solve a puzzle in Resident Evil 1 is Jill saving many people's lives. That's like saying Meryl opening that gate to allow Snake to go to that tank battle in MGS1 is Meryl saving Snake's life. Thankfully, this point is so illogical and stupid that most Resident Evil fans by now already figured out the logical fallacies and inconsistencies with this argument. But for those who didn't, here is the problem. Solving puzzles to progress in a game is not explicitly saving someone else's life. Without solving those puzzles, everyone, including the protagonist, does not get to progress with the mission. If Meryl didn't open that level 5 gate, it wouldn't have allowed for events to happen that eventually led to Meryl escaping. If Jill didn't turn that crank and solve that puzzle, Jill would be stuck as well. If Claire didn't solve those puzzles, Claire herself would be stuck. On the other hand, remember in Metal Gear Solid 3 when Naked Snake swung in to save Eva's life and took that bullet in his eye? That is explicitly saving someone's life. Naked Snake didn't have to do it. Claire grabbing Steve's arm and getting him out of that chamber with the gas leak, that is Claire explicitly saving his life. She didn't have to do it. Steve jumping in and saving Claire from the Bandersnatch and Steve killing his zombie dad is Steve explicitly saving Claire's life twice. He didn't have to do it. So please don't bring up this baseless argument with me. I respect the right for people to have baseless opinions, but unfortunately, it would do no justice if I treat a valid opinion and a baseless opinion with the same amount of respect.